36 hours into a psychology experiment that was supposed to run for 2 full weeks, a 20-year-old Stanford student was curled up on the floor of a mock prison cell, screaming that he was burning up inside, while the man running the study stood outside the bars, watching, and didn't let him go. That student hadn't committed a crime. He'd answered a newspaper ad offering $15 a day for a study on prison life. And within a day and a half, the experiment had already stopped looking like an experiment. This is the Stanford Prison Experiment. And depending on who you ask, it's either the most important psychology study of the 20th century or one of its most famous cautionary tales about what happens when scientists get too close to their own results. Both of those things are true at the same time. In August of 1971, a Stanford psychology professor named Philip Zimbardo took 24 ordinary young men, college students screened for good mental health, no criminal history, no drug use, and randomly assigned half of them to be prisoners and half to be guards in a fake prison built in the basement of the psychology building. Real Palo Alto police cooperated with the arrests to make it feel authentic. Within 24 hours, guards who had never shown a hint of cruelty in their lives were inventing new ways to humiliate the men in their custody. Within 36, one prisoner had a breakdown severe enough to be pulled from the study. And within 6 days, a third of the planned length, the entire experiment was shut down, not by Zimbardo, but because someone from outside the situation looked at what was happening and refused to accept that it was normal. The study became so famous that it shaped how we think about war crimes, prison abuse, and ordinary people doing terrible things. It's also become one of the most contested studies in the history of psychology because the full story of what happened behind the scenes is messier and more human than the version that made it into textbooks. So let's actually get into it. Zimbardo wasn't trying to build a haunted house. He had a specific, fairly narrow question, funded in part by the U.S. Office of Naval Research, which was interested in understanding conflict inside military prisons. The question was this: when you put good people into a bad situation, a situation with real power imbalances, real rules, and real consequences, does the situation win? Or does personal character hold the line? To test it, his team ran newspaper ads in the Palo Alto area asking for male college students willing to participate in a 2-week study of prison life for $15 a day, which was decent money at the time. More than 70 people responded. The researchers screened them down to 24, the healthiest, most stable, most normal candidates they could find, specifically to rule out the idea that anything extreme happening later could be blamed on someone being unusually disturbed to begin with. Then they flipped a coin. Half became prisoners. Half became guards. The setting was the basement of Jordan Hall, gutted and rebuilt to look like a real cell block. 3 small rooms turned into cells, a hallway that functioned as the yard, and a closet, barely big enough to stand in, that became solitary confinement. They called it, without much creativity, the hole. On the first day, the prisoners weren't just told to show up. They were arrested at their actual homes by real Palo Alto police officers who'd agreed to play along for realism. Fingerprinted, blindfolded, and driven to the mock prison. Once there, they were strip-searched, deloused with a spray, dressed in loose smocks with no underwear, and given a chain around one ankle. Instead of shaving their heads, which Zimbardo felt would be too much even for this, they were given tight nylon stocking caps to simulate it. From that point on, they weren't called by name. They were numbers. The guards, meanwhile, got khaki uniforms, mirrored sunglasses, specifically so prisoners couldn't see their eyes, which strips away a basic layer of human connection, and wooden batons they were told not to use for actual violence. Beyond that one restriction, the guards were given almost no instructions. Keep order. Nothing more specific than that. Zimbardo himself took on the role of prison superintendent, which is worth sitting with, because it meant the person meant to be objectively observing the study was also, structurally, one of its authority figures. On day 1, by most accounts, things were almost calm. A little awkward, a little performative, like people trying on costumes. That didn't last. The shift started on the second day, and it started with something almost mundane. The prisoners rebelled. They barricaded their cell doors with their beds and taunted the guards, refusing to come out for a count. It wasn't violent. It was closer to a dorm room prank than a prison riot. But it forced a decision point for the guards, who suddenly had to figure out, on their own, what keeping order actually meant when someone pushed back. What they landed on was psychological pressure, and it escalated fast. They used a fire extinguisher to spray the barricaded prisoners. They stripped the ringleaders and put them in isolation. And critically, they started dividing the prisoners against each other, giving better treatment, real beds and food, to the cells that hadn't participated in the rebellion, then swapping who got the good treatment the next day so no one could trust anyone else. That tactic, sowing distrust between people who should be allies, is a documented and deliberate strategy real oppressive institutions have used for exactly this reason. It works faster than force does. By the end of day 2, something had already changed in the room. The guards weren't following a script anymore. They were improvising cruelty and getting more comfortable doing it. This is where the psychology underneath the story starts to explain what you're watching, instead of just watching it happen. Psychologists call this de-individuation, the process by which anonymity and a group identity strip away someone's sense of personal accountability. The mirrored sunglasses weren't a costume choice. They removed the guard's individual identity and replaced it with a role. The numbers replacing prisoners' names did the same thing in reverse, stripped away individual humanity, so it was easier to treat someone as a category instead of a person. Guards started waking prisoners at 2 and 2:30 in the morning for head counts that served no purpose except exhaustion. Push-ups became routine punishment, sometimes with a guard resting a boot on a prisoner's back while he did them. Privileges, meals, mattresses, bathroom access were handed out and taken away seemingly at random, which is its own specific form of psychological destabilization, because when punishment stops being predictable, people stop being able to plan around it. They just become anxious all the time. One guard in particular became the story's most infamous figure. Prisoners nicknamed him John Wayne. His real name was Dave Eshelman, because he adopted an exaggerated Southern accent and became the most inventive and cruel guard in the study. He's the one credited with escalating things into outright degradation, forcing prisoners to simulate sex acts with each other, making them chant demeaning phrases, pushing the psychological humiliation further than almost anyone else involved. What's genuinely unsettling is that by his own later account, he wasn't a sadist walking around in daily life. He said he treated it almost like an acting role he was committed to playing convincingly. That's the detail that should actually bother you more than the cruelty itself. Not that a cruel person found an outlet, but that an ordinary person found a role and leaned all the way into it. 36 hours in, prisoner number 8612, a student named Douglas Corpy, had the breakdown that ended up defining the study's most replayed footage. He started sobbing, screaming that he was burning up inside, banging on the door, clearly in acute distress. It's worth pausing on what happened next, because it says something important. Zimbardo and his team initially tried to talk him into staying, framing it almost like he was quitting on his fellow prisoners. He was only released once it became clear he genuinely couldn't continue. If you're the kind of person who wants to actually understand why people behave the way they do under pressure, not just the shock value, but the mechanism underneath it, that's basically the whole reason this channel exists. Hit subscribe if that's your thing, because we go a lot deeper into cases like this one. Now, here's where the story gets more complicated than the famous version, and it matters enough that we need to slow down for it. Decades later, Corpy gave interviews saying his breakdown wasn't quite the spontaneous psychological collapse it's often presented as. He said he was frustrated he couldn't just study for an exam he needed to prepare for, believed he wasn't allowed to simply quit, and essentially performed a breakdown convincing enough to guarantee his release. In 2018, writer Ben Blum published a widely read investigation revisiting the experiment's credibility, and French scholar Thibault Le Texier conducted an extensive analysis of Zimbardo's archived materials. Both raised serious questions. Some guards said, years later, that they felt coached toward harsher behavior rather than arriving at it purely on their own. Some of the study's most dramatic moments may have been shaped, at least partly, by what participants believed the researchers wanted to see. Zimbardo's own notes suggest he gave guards more direction than the official story let on, telling them to create feelings of fear and powerlessness rather than simply observing what emerged naturally. This doesn't erase what happened. Real people were really humiliated, really distressed, really pushed past what they'd agreed to. But it's honest to tell you the record is contested, not just cinematic. The experiment was less a clean scientific observation and more a kind of guided performance that produced real psychological harm along the way. The study kept going after Corpy's release, and it kept getting worse. Zimbardo's team even ran mock parole hearings, and something genuinely strange happened there. Several prisoners, when given the choice, asked to be paroled, meaning they'd forfeit the money they were being paid, rather than simply quitting the study outright, even though quitting was, on paper, always an option. That's how deeply the prisoner identity had settled in. People stopped acting like paid volunteers and started acting like inmates. One prisoner later described feeling genuine shame when he was denied parole by the mock board, even though he knew intellectually that none of it was real. Another talked about how he'd stopped thinking of himself by his actual name and had started identifying entirely with his prisoner number. These weren't people with weak personalities or fragile egos. They were psychologically healthy young men who, within days, had internalized a role so completely that the boundary between performance and reality had effectively dissolved. The guards, for their part, weren't universally cruel. About a third became genuinely abusive. Another third were tough but fair, enforcing rules without unnecessary cruelty. And the final third were what researchers later called good guards, those who never abused their power and sometimes even did small kindnesses for prisoners when the harsh guards weren't watching. But here's the critical part. Even the good guards almost never intervened to stop the bad ones. They looked away. They stayed quiet. They let it happen. And that passivity, that unwillingness to push back against the cruelty even when you're not participating in it directly, is its own form of complicity that shows up in almost every real-world institutional abuse case you can name. The study finally ended on day 6, a third of the way through its planned 2 weeks, and it ended because of one person. Christina Maslach, a recent Stanford PhD graduate who was dating Zimbardo at the time and would later become his wife. She came to observe the prison and watch guards march a line of hooded, chained prisoners to the bathroom, treating it like a routine logistical exercise. She was the only one of roughly 50 outside observers who'd visited the study to react with open horror instead of clinical interest. She confronted Zimbardo directly, telling him, in essence, that what he was doing to those young men was wrong, not academically interesting, not a methodological curiosity, just wrong. Zimbardo later credited that conversation, and specifically her willingness to push back against him when almost no one else had, with snapping him out of his own role as superintendent. He ended the study the next day. The Stanford Prison Experiment became one of the most cited studies in the history of psychology, for a reason that goes beyond shock value. It offered a disturbingly plausible explanation for how ordinary people commit atrocities without necessarily being monsters to begin with. Zimbardo spent much of the rest of his career developing that idea, eventually writing an entire book about it called The Lucifer Effect. And in 2004 he testified as an expert witness in the defense of a U.S. Army reservist involved in the abuses at Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq, arguing that the situation, not just the individuals, had to be understood to explain what happened there. That's the uncomfortable part of this study's legacy. It's not really about whether Zimbardo's specific experiment was methodologically perfect, and the more recent scrutiny suggests it wasn't. It's about the fact that its central warning keeps getting independently confirmed in the real world, in real institutions, over and over. Give ordinary people unchecked authority, strip the people under them of individual identity, remove accountability, and let the situation run long enough without anyone from outside stepping in. And you don't need cruel people to get a cruel outcome. You just need a system that makes cruelty feel like the job. You don't need a fake prison to see a small version of this. It's why anonymous online spaces get uglier than in-person ones. It's why just following procedure is such a common excuse in every institutional scandal you've ever read about. And it's exactly what happened in the 2005 hazing death of a 19-year-old student at a U.S. university, where members of an organization forced pledges through escalating physical abuse over weeks. When investigators asked why no one stopped it, the answer kept coming back to the same thing. Everyone assumed someone higher up had approved it, that this was how it was supposed to go, and by the time anyone questioned it out loud, a teenager was dead. That's de-individuation in a campus basement instead of a Stanford one. Same mechanism, same result. The people who stop bad situations from spiraling are almost never the ones inside the system. They're the ones like Christina Maslach, standing just outside it, still able to see it clearly. That's one of the study's most important but least discussed lessons. When you're embedded in a structure, when you've taken on a role within it, your perspective warps in ways you don't notice happening. You start seeing the abnormal as normal because everyone around you is treating it as normal. The guards didn't wake up on day one planning to degrade other human beings. They got there incrementally, one small escalation at a time, each one feeling justifiable in the moment because the environment had normalized what came before it. And by day 6, behavior that would have horrified them on day 1 felt routine. So, the experiment's so disturbing they had to shut it down early. 6 days out of a planned 14. Not because the guards ran out of ideas, and not because the prisoners simply endured it. It ended because one outsider looked at what normal had quietly become inside that basement and said, out loud, that it wasn't normal at all. If this was the first time you'd heard the full version, the breakdown, the John Wayne guard, the controversy over how much of it was real versus performed, tell me in the comments which part actually surprised you most. Was it Corpy's later admission that he partly faked his breakdown? Was it the coaching allegations against Zimbardo? Or was it how the study actually ended, with an outsider finally stepping in? Let me know. And if you want more of these deep, honest walks through the psychology behind real cases, subscribe, because there's a lot more where this came from.